began to explore the great matter of birth and death. Where did Jen go? Where did she come from? What are we doing here? What am I? What am I? And the question I often ask was, is this it?
Mm.
Is this all there is to it? Is this the show we're involved in? The show is over. We call it a day. I felt as though I didn't really know any of those answers. So that's really the reason I think I hope people come to spiritual practice, is that they start to realize that they can't seem to find the answers they're looking for. And a lot of people aren't asking the questions to begin with.
So, just before we hit record, you said that today you are doing a zazenkai.
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
The zazenkai is traditionally a one-day meditation intensive in the Rinzai and Soto Zen traditions.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, it will start quite early. It'll vary depending on location. My wife and I start pretty early in the day, and then we'll go throughout the day. And it basically consists of walking, mainly seated meditation called zazen, and some chanting and prostrations. But it keeps going like that, more or less. So you do a sit, walk, sit, walk, and so forth. So why would anyone do that? Is that a reasonable question?
We'll get to that. But if you were to,
okay.
if you were, I guess, to add up, how many hours a week you do something like this, or how frequently you meditate or practice what you just described, what would you say?
This is great. Hopefully your friends like Malcolm Gladwell. Okay, so I sit between 3 to 4 hours a day, an ordinary day. It's about 6 times a week. And then it really depends on our zazenkai today. So we can have this conversation. So I can have this conversation with you. We're stopping a bit early, but it might range from 6 to 10 hours on every Saturday. So every Saturday is a zazenkai. And then once a month, we'll have a approximately 4 to 6 day sesshin, which is more or less a stacking the zazenkai one after the other. And then that's something like 7, 8, 9 hours a day of sitting, not including the other walking. And basically in Zen, everything can be turned into a meditation. Eating, meditation, walking is meditation, and so on. So I don't know if I did the math, but it's a high number for someone who's a layperson.
Yeah, yeah. And the setup really here is, how did you get to a point where it seemed important enough to you to do that, to commit the majority of your time, it seems, to meditate?
Very incrementally. Depends on where we want to start. Well, the most poignant place to begin, and you know the story already, is that my eldest sister died in 2014. She died of a late stage cancer. She was diagnosed in December 2013, and then she lived only 12 more weeks and died in the spring of 2014. And it wasn't immediately the case that I started wondering about all these really basic things. Of course, you already know that I've been wondering about them in philosophical ways for many years before that. I know that people around the world, but there was something really quite poignant and penetrating that seemed to have occurred around that time. So my wife and I began to explore what Zen really nicely calls the great matter of birth and death, great matter of life and death. Where did Jen go? Where did she come from? What are we doing here? What am I? What am I? And the question I often ask was, is this it?
Mm.
Is this all there is to it? Is this the show we're involved in? The show is over, and we call it a day. I felt as though I didn't really know any of those answers. So that's really the reason I think people come. I hope people come to spiritual practices, that they start to realize that they can't seem to find the answers they're looking for, and a lot of people aren't asking the questions to begin with. So I don't want to mislead people. I'm actually a non-dualist. Zen Buddhism is the primary practice. There are other practices I'm involved in. But suffice to say, these Eastern paths are very powerful, and that they can carry you all the way home to what you truly are. And that's what it didn't happen in a day. So this is 2014. I'm just beginning to explore as you might explore playing the piano, or as you might explore learning a sport. It wasn't deeply flavorful, but these paths seem to operate in the following manner. The more shraddha is the Sanskrit term for faithful and earnest and enthusiastic you are, the more that grows, the more is disclosed, the more it comes to seem as if there's really not that you're somehow directing the path, but the path is unfolding in a way that it's almost pulling you along with it. You can't really deviate from the path at a certain point. Right? You and I have discussed the fact that I said I had nowhere else to go, nowhere else to turn. And that's absolutely true.
Do you think there was other than your sister's death, do you think there was another inflection point where you realized you had nowhere else to go, or the path itself had fully taken you?
There are all sorts of inflection points. It really depends on how we want to tell the story. So in 2009, I finished a PhD and left academia. That was an earlier inflection point, and that led me to wanting to lead a philosophical life. And then the Socratic philosophizing was what helped to birth, so to speak, this 2014 experience. Because had I not been open, very, very open to all these sorts of questions about the nature of good life, and there are philosophical questions: what's a good life? How does one lead a good life? What is wisdom? What is the role of philosophical conversation, and so on? These, if you travel in a Socratic way for a long enough period of time, you might end up in something that starts to pitch you beyond philosophy. That's what I felt. For example, if you read Pierre Hadot, you find that this is someone who's talking about philosophy as a way of life. He suggests that, as you know, classical philosophy was concerned with spiritual exercises whose point and purpose was to change our perception of the world so we could live a wise life. He's one of the first that I'm aware of who began to foreground what he calls ascesis, or spiritual exercises, or full exercises. But I feel as though if you take that thread far enough, and as it seems to have happened for me, you end up, as I was using the metaphor before, pitching into a spiritual practice. So that's just one way of going back to go into philosophy and then forward into spirituality. The other thing I've realized, much to my almost chagrin, is that philosophy, though wonderful, though amazing, just can't take you the whole way. So thousands upon thousands, you asked how many hours I've been meditating. Well, philosophizing with people for 10,000, 20,000 hours over the last decade. When I use the Malcolm Gladwell.
Yeah, Gladwell will be proud of you.
And it just seems as though the discourse, reasoning discourse, only takes you so far. And I found that when I say much to my chagrin, what I mean is that it just starts to bump up against its inherent limitations. It places you in a realm of silence. When the philosophical conversation goes well, it moves you into silence. But that's exactly where true meditation begins
Right.
and ends. And so what is that silence? What is here? And I'm asking those questions aloud, of course, but those questions are answered non-linguistically, non-discursively. So that was another realization. And I mean, quite frankly, what's difficult about this question is that there's a certain point at which it starts to feel as if everything is leading in one direction. That's why one reason I'm struggling to pick out some inflection points is that it starts to feel as if there's a certain kind of centrifugal force. Well, I had this incident with a neighbor. Oh, spiritual practice. Oh, I was talking to my mother. Oh, well, spiritual practice. Buddhists will say everyone is my teacher, or everything is my teacher. And it sounds kind of trite. It sort of sounds pretty cute, but after a while, what? It is. It's true. Everything seems to get kind of pulled back into, or never leaves, really. It's just, as my Zen teacher would say, the practice becomes constant and complete. It starts to feel as if you can never actually leave it. You can't leave it. I mean, I'm going to bed at night. I'm meditating, but my wife is lying on me and meditating there. I wake up to pee in the middle of the night. I'm 42 years old and I have to pee. And I'm just, I'm meditating. I go back to bed. Before I fall asleep, I'm meditating. I wake up in the morning, I'm meditating. I'm walking and meditating. Now that makes it sound as if I'm trying to do something. It's more like it keeps happening.
Mm-hmm. So is it that at a certain point, and maybe we can't pinpoint it, but at a certain point, it just picks up its own momentum, and the sense of doing it or sitting to meditate doesn't even make sense anymore?
Yeah, exactly right. So consider the tradition of karma yoga. The Bhagavad Gita describes 3 paths: Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge; Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion and love; and Karma Yoga, the path of selfless doing, or selfless action. What's said about Karma Yoga is 2 things. One is that you begin to act. Supposing when we're on this path, it's not really quite the path I'm on, but it might help to illustrate something here. You act and you give the results up to Krishna. You basically abandon the results or the fruits of your action.
Mm-hmm.
So you could say in Buddhist language, you act with non-attachment, but you really dig in to act with non-attachment. That's the first part. The second part, though, is more crucial. You come to realize, if you're really on a karma yoga path, that there is no doer here. So there is no doer behind the doing. So there is no doership. It's just doing. It's just pure doing, as Buddhists would say, right? It's just completely processual. There's no doer. There's no one to whom it's done. There's no recipient of the gift. And if you even go farther, that if you want to say more, you can say there's no recipient. In a certain respect, there's no doing, and there is no doer. It's all just a seamless processual unfolding. So the reason I brought that up is that that's how it starts to feel. I can use Taoist language if that helps. It's just that everything starts to flow along in accordance with the way of things, the Tao. And it stops feeling as if you're resisting, you're trying to do something, you're trying to achieve something or other, which we call awakening or liberation. It's everything is just happening.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as though I think to myself, would it be nice to sit and meditate today, or would it be nice to? Same happens in philosophizing. It's not that I think, oh, it's so nice to philosophize today. I just find myself sitting on the cushion. I find myself philosophizing. I find myself talking to my friend Daniel.
So
without a lot of vacillations and premeditations, and everything is sort of just carrying on.
Yeah. So I think I get that in some sense, but there's also a paradox from one vantage point where you said you start to realize that everything is just happening on its own. And it almost sounds like you need to do something first to have that realization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So to me, that feels kind of paradoxical, because there is some doership maybe initially, and then at some point it falls away. Is that how you'd put it? Or
Well,
there never was any doership?
Now we're getting into some Nondual teaching. So the teaching that these teachings would say, there is, I'll try to put it without any kind of subject-object language, there is the realization that there never was a doer in the first place. That's only so helpful as a teaching. However, I'm in a camp that basically says there needs to be some muscle applied for some time until it is realized that there never needed to be any muscle in the first place. So consider the example of a Zen sesshin. Suppose it's your first meditation retreat. It's going to be hard. It's going to be painful. The body, it depends on how long those sessions. Some of these sessions are very rigorous. They're 10, 12 hours of meditating, not including, seated meditation, not including the other forms of meditation that it's pointing to. There are some that don't involve sleeping during the night. There's night sits as well, and free sits, yasa. If you've never been on a retreat before, this is going to be brutal. And you'll be tired and hungry, and you'll be thinking, and you'll be having all sorts of cravings for food. So there's a lot of effort involved. And this is just one particular way of describing it. So maybe I can help us out by talking about Patanjali, who's has something called the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. There's a very nice description here. He begins by talking about, in one of the later books, about dharana. And he says that this is basically one is going to apply a lot of efforts to get to one-pointedness. We could discuss what that means. But roughly speaking, you're going from a very distracted, dispersed, wandering mind to, so my Zen teacher would put it, like, shoo. And I was just holding it to illustrate, right? You feel a bit of that, right? That's one-pointedness. And then there's a holding. And then that once one starts to master that, it's required a fair amount of effort of bringing it back to the breath or bringing it back to the count, whatever the meditation technique is. Then there is a possibility of entering into what he calls dhyana, which is a more effortless, what Zen calls samadhi. It's a samadhi state in which there are very few thoughts. One's entered into a very energetic state where there's a certain kind of well-being and joy. But once you cross that threshold, and I don't make it sound so linear, because if your mother says something that really hurt you on Tuesday, you might sit down and just find that it's a complete noisy disaster. But generally speaking, it starts to trend toward the sense of effortless flowering, or effortless effervescence. And it becomes clear that everything, at that point, it's starting to become clear everything is just happening. Thoughts are arising and falling, sensations are rising and falling. Even the ego is rising and falling, right, in the form of a particular samskara or ego tendency. All of this is just this very well, nicely described by Buddhists. It's just coming and going, breathing and unbreathing. And then it could be said for the path, that the path is no longer that which you're trotting on. The path is, so to speak, carrying you along with it.
And that's always the case. It's just we don't realize that.
Yeah, it's always the case. Yeah. This is where our modern presupposition that there is an ontologically distinct, autonomous agent in control of his life, that it's, upon further inspection, is a pretty dubious presupposition. It has some utility. It's if you want to operationalize it and say that there are certain things that I did, there are certain things for which I'm responsible, I think it makes a certain amount of social sense. But in the final analysis, once you peel back the layers, as people say today, it's pretty clear that it's not what's happening. Right? It's a web of interconnected relationships. And things are flowing as they flow. Now, that might seem as if to one who's committed to free will, as if it's really quite scary. But what's happening there is someone's holding on to a separate position or separate point of view. It's only scary and feels lonesome and despairing if there's a positing of a separate point of view out here, and then everything is seemingly happening in the foreground, and I can't do anything about it. But if there's only the breathing of God's very being, in and out, creation, the stasis and the dissolution, creation, the stasis of dissolution, then so also for Daniel and Andrew. So it has always been.
If this is how it's always been and how it is, then why is it so difficult to realize for most people?
Well, now there are lots of. That's like a frequently asked question. It's good. There are different ways of describing it. So that's just where the tradition, called the core non-dual teaching, as I might call it, tends to disagree a little bit. There's slightly different shadings. So here are a few answers. You can give you an array of answers. Well, the Buddha says, the cause of our, slightly different question, but cause of our suffering is selfish desire. It's one interpretation. It's a second noble truth. Why is it the case that we suffer? So, by the way, why do we suffer at all? Well, because there's a sense of separation. Right? I take myself to be an ontologically distinct entity with a life of my own, right, for which I'm responsible, over which I have a certain degree of control. And that's usually the starting point for the inquiry in a non-dual sense. And it's pretty clear you can verify that in experience. Anytime you don't feel separate from the rest, there is no suffering. Now, there can be no push or pull. If there's just a situatedness of this particular psychophysical organism enmeshed in and within the WHOLE, the whole. Right? So we have to begin our analysis or inquire with separation. So, or presumptive or ignorant sense of separation, really. So I like the Indian answer. Usually they will just appeal to ignorance. So it's a very short answer. But the short answer is that there's an account of ignorance, the veil of Maya. So when the one all, when God, or when the true self, let me back up. So suppose it's the case we begin with the true self or God. And there's only the true self or God. It's just the one reality, and that one reality is universal consciousness. I guess your viewers would have to accept that for the moment as an operating premise. What's really quite mysterious is that this one reality, I'll call it God, just to keep it simple in terms of naming. It could be called Tao or Shunyata or whatever. This God, this one reality, has a natural tendency to vibrate. Who knows why? So it's important because why is there something rather than no thing at all? As philosophers have been inclined to ask, why is there the many, not just the one? As Platonists asked. Well, somehow, mysteriously so, the one all vibrates. And that natural vibratory tendency ends up exuding or bringing forth out of itself, which is none other than itself, various and sundry forms. Universes, nation states, reptiles, bodies of water, everything, right? Every concrete thing and every idea as well. Everything is only that, or this, capital T. So now we come to humans. And so what seems to happen is that there's what Kashmir Shaivists call condensation or contraction. in order for God to condense or concretize God's self as Daniel or Andrew, there's a certain kind of forgetting that takes place, or veiling, such that it's going to sound weird to keep using third person, so I won't keep doing that. So I, Andrew, looking through my eyes, am simply the focalization of God, who now can know the world dualistically. Now can reflect. Now I can reflect on myself. I have the capacity for self-reflective, capacity for self-reflection. But all this comes at the cost, so to speak, of having forgotten for a while that I am nothing other than God in a particular garb or form. So it's a little bit as if God had to make a sacrifice, to put it rather poetically, right?
Mm-hmm.
In order to manifest God's self in the form of Andrew, God had to pretend that he'd forgotten, or she'd forgotten, whichever pronoun you want to use here, God's self. And in consequence, God now believes that he's Andrew. I believe that this is what I believe that I am. And I feel that that's so. That's called ignorance. And there, this is just a very short account of ignorance. So realization is, or enlightenment, or waking up, is just what Ramana Maharshi would say, going back the way you came. To put it poetically, one begins to investigate, or the various ways of doing it. These are meditation techniques. There are various ways of investigating who or what I take myself from this point of view, from the point of view of being a separate subject, who or what I take myself to be. And I keep finding, I'm an inquiry kind of guy, so I keep finding that the answers don't really stack up. So I take myself to be a common one. I take myself to be thought. It's very early. No, wait a minute. There's someone here contemplating thoughts, and wait, thoughts come and go, but I haven't come and gone. Oh, well, it turns out that I'm not thought. Then we can keep going through the process. I won't go through it at length here unless we need to. But suffice to say, as one keeps going through the process, there's a kind of a stepping back, or a sinking back, or expansion, depending on the metaphor you want to use. And there can come a time at which all the limitations brought about by a kind of ignorance drop, at least momentarily. If it drops momentarily, that's what Zen Buddhists call kensho.
Mm-hmm.
Just seeing everything that was just described very intellectually. So that's an account to describe how this happens. Now, why do so few people realize their true nature? So that's a second question. I mean, it builds off the first. I hope that's clear.
Yeah.
Okay. I like Ramana Maharshi's answer. I think it's very compassionate. So I'm going to paraphrase a story of this satsang, or this dialogue. Someone comes to Ramana Maharshi when he's still teaching at Ramana Ashram until he dies in 1940 or so. Not sure if that's quite the right date, but thereabouts. And the person says, "Well, I heard you're teaching." By the way, Ramana Maharshi's highest teaching was silence. You just sit in silence with him. Just a very, very direct teaching. It must have been magnificent. I would have thought. Just completely profound. But he would also come out of silence, and he would try to meet people where they were. It's upadesa, or spiritual instruction. So let's suppose this fellow comes and says, "I heard what you said, and you said that I am Brahma, universal consciousness, or I'm this one reality." And the man says, I heard what you said, and I don't freaking get it." Right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is what happens to most of us. You hear this stuff and you're like, okay, that sounds pretty interesting. But if you hear it and you're not even on this path, you just think it sounds kind of nutty, actually. Mm-hmm. Right? But if you start to be open to it, read the Upanishads or some of these texts, wow, what the hell are we talking about? But maybe you get a feeling there's something here, right? I imagine that man is, I want to realize my true nature. I want to know what I am in a capitalized sense. I'm here, I'm listening, I'm in silence with you. I don't understand. I really don't. I haven't realized. What am I missing? And Ramana Maharshi says, "Oh, well, basically you have vasanas or samskaras.
Mm.
That's the account I think is very good. So due to the preponderance of samskaras, you can't quite see the mirror because the mirror is covered with specks of dust and dirt and so on. So samskaras, I would define, this might not be consistent with these traditions, I have my own view. I define samskaras as basically being what essentially I think and feel I am. So if I essentially think that I am the knower, then this is going to color, by me here, I'm for an Andrew, this is going to color my ordinary experience. I'm going to wake up and I have to know how to make the coffee. Just so. And I go to meetings and I have to know, to be the one who knows the right thing to say or what the right account to give is. And so not just my thoughts and my feelings, but also my actions are colored just so long as I maintain my stance as the samskaric knower. And there are all sorts of samskaras. But how can I possibly realize this restful, open, spacious, infinite, eternal being so long as I'm gripping onto being the knower, the caretaker, seer, That's the account I think is quite persuasive.
Just to maybe add some color to this, is this similar to when someone who's like, let's say, been a corporate lawyer their entire life and they really identify with that job, all of a sudden gets fired or something happens and they have a deep existential crisis because they don't know who they are? Is that analogous to the idea of samskara, or is that more than analogous? Is that also kind of a samskaric relationship with the role of a lawyer?
I would say it's, I don't know how technical we want to get here in my my view, but that's a little bit downstream. So let's so yes, there is identification. I am a lawyer. Right? This Advaita Vedanta would say, I am this or I'm that. The problem starts with the this or the that, not with the I am. So if we just allow your viewer just for a moment to say, if you just sit at I am, don't add anything, I am. There's just a restfulness and peacefulness. And what in Sanskrit is called ananda. There's just a little hint of peace, and calm. There's awareness. It's undeniably so. There's awareness, but not awareness of objects. And there is existence or beingness. This is called Sit Chat Ananda. Those are the clues about the nature of reality. I think they're really good clues. Awareness or consciousness, existence, and the taste of bliss, non-circumstantial, non-contingent, non-desirous happiness. So the trouble, so to speak, begins when the person in question, we'll call John, condenses himself down into the identification with the lawyer. So that is an identification, and it's going to bring about suffering, as is evident here. He's going to suffer whenever it's the case that he gets what he wants. He's going to suffer whenever it's the case he doesn't get what he wants. He's going to suffer whenever there are limit cases where he's asked to do things that seem to be beneath him because he's a lawyer. There are going to be cases where he loses a job and he can't get as good of a job as he had before. There are going to be cases in which, due to status games, he's going to not be as high in the status hierarchy as he'd like to be relative to being a lawyer and having a certain career. Those are all forms of suffering brought about by I am a lawyer. But a samskara is a little higher than that. And it's probably operating in the case of being a lawyer. So I would say, to use a shorthand, it's a bit like a personality type or an Enneagram type. So you could, theoretically, this person could lose the job with a lawyer. And if he had never quite identified with being a lawyer, he would be just fine. But it wouldn't actually yet touch the samskara. Maybe the samskara is I'm a caretaker. And he's able to very nimbly, in his ordinary, relative, conventional life, shift He's taking care of his mother because he identifies with being a caretaker. Now, when you get to that level of analysis and you start to disrupt your samskaric identifications, then you can have a real existential crisis.
Mm.
You can have one at the level you were suggesting for sure. But the reason that it's devastating at that level is that there is yet to be, well, let me put it differently. It can be a crisis, but the real crisis is something like, I keep asking the question, I don't know who I am, and I can't seem to attach to a samskara. I don't know where they are right now.
Mm.
The greater crisis is a great one, is to realize that you are none of these samskaras. You are no such ego identification at the highest possible, most ethereal level. Right? These are constituents of personality that when you're deep in meditation, you can start to see them coming and going. They kind of come in and out. They wax and wane, but you're seeing them. So they can't be you.
Yeah, I feel like the analogy of possession, right? Like being possessed by a demon or like a spirit that isn't you,
Mm-hmm.
helps me understand this. And in my own life, I can draw a thread to my childhood and to the samskaric personality patterns that I have today. So certain things that maybe I was rewarded for when I was a kid or punished for. And then that creates certain personality patterns that are stable, and I can confuse them for me. And then in states of meditation, I start to see them as something separate from me. But they often seem to be things that relate to my childhood or things that I learned when I was very, very young. Is that the case in general for samskaras? Are they things that develop during critical developmental periods when you're growing up?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. I have no idea. I mean, it depends on how far one wants to go with this. I mean, one thing to say is that your question is lovely, but it's also null and void. Does it matter? Is a proper reply?
Right.
They're here. They're here, and you've identified yourself with this or that or the other. So long as that occurs, there's going to be some form of dis-ease or disturbance. I think
my intention.
You're probably right to say. I can answer a little bit less cheekily. You're probably right that a number of them do develop at critical moments in psychosocial development. I wouldn't disagree with that. I don't know because I'm not a developmental psychologist, quite frankly. But the other part that's left out as a count is, who knows, if rebirth is true, it might be from prior lives too, if we're willing to grant that presupposition for the moment. So as a meta remark, I would say, I'll give you an example of what I think is a really quite a helpful concept, and that comes from Hume, and that's the inner child. I think it's a great concept. I think it's great because I've seen it my own. I've seen it. I've seen a particular phenomenon, and the best label I have for it is the inner child. So the inner child, I basically would say, and I haven't read Hume on this. This is my own meditative and philosophical study of myself, of my relative self. The inner child is just a reservoir of hurt. All it basically says is, I'm hurting. That's the way I articulate it. And then there are various ways of spinning that out. You can have a bioemotive framework. There are all sorts of frameworks at that point, but I think chief among all is I'm hurting. And then we're going to see rising of emotions and patterns of thought, basically recursive patterns of thought and emotion. So for me, I see anger. And that's a common one. I got it from my childhood. And I also see pride, a lot of prideful thoughts. I didn't know that they were prideful thoughts, but lo and behold, they seem to suggest that I'm the one who knows the right sorts of things to say, and the other one doesn't quite know and is being instructed accordingly.
Right.
Whereas it's vengefulness, but it has the intellectual veneer of presumptive validity. So I don't know where the samskaras come from. I think your hypothesis is as good as any. But my simple, fairly non-intellectual point is that they're here. And I should add something so that people don't misunderstand what I'm saying. they do have some utility. Uh, we've already talked about and I'm willing at the conventional level to accept that there's an agent. If we want to say that we're agents, that's fine. It's so long as we don't reify or hypostasize and dig in our heels. I'm perfectly content with saying that. It's just not ultimately true, so far as I can tell. Likewise, we need to have personalities. Sometimes people think that enlightenment means that there's the complete erasure of personalities. Of course not. They're helping to operationalize the body mind. Um, how do we get to how does God come to laugh? Right? There needs to be form, right? A basic form or template or archetype in order for there to be laughter or wryness or amusement. Now, hopefully, the unwholesome aspects of personalities fall away with deeper and deeper realizations. But I just want to make that clear so that people don't misunderstand me and think that Samskaras are bad or even embodiment is bad. It's not. These are just forms of forgetfulness or ignorance. And once we start to examine in a Socratic way or in the way that the Buddha taught, then we're not chucking them by the wayside. We're just disentangling. We're disentangling ourselves from some pretty profound misunderstandings. They're going to still, the wholesome aspects of experience are still going to be there. They're just going to be rearranged owing to the depth of our introspective study.
This makes me wonder, from a non-dual perspective, how does one think about morality? Like, how do you distinguish between a wholesome versus unwholesome samskara?
Let's set aside. Let's set aside the wholesome and unwholesome samskara. I mean, it's easier if you just accept that one part of the investigation and these Eastern practices is what's called direct experience. It's hard to really define it philosophically because it's a basic term. I guess you would say that it's whatever is arising here and now. And if one is able to be more sensitive and mindful and reflective, and all those words are kind of, and those processes get sharpened the more you meditate, then it's just intuitively the case that you can discern between wholesome and unwholesome. If you have a thought, you can start to philosophize and say, well, it has to do with the intention. You can start to get an ethical theory worked up here. But roughly speaking, in the experience, it becomes clear that no, this looks like a wholesome way of relating to someone, but this is really just vengefulness. I don't know how one knows that because one isn't standing back from it reflexively. It's just immediately clear. The discernment process, in my experience, just starts to sift itself out into wholesome and unwholesome. It doesn't require some metacognitive reconsideration and further working up. It's more intuitive.
There's like a spontaneous discernment.
Yeah, that's right. I suppose it's a little bit like asking, if I can use an analogy with athletes, it's a bit like asking the athlete, how did you know to, turn left right there rather than right when you're on the field? Well, maybe we can give an Aristotelian answer, according to which I've been doing this sort of thing time and time again in all sorts of situations. I've developed certain kind of excellencies or virtues of character, but in that situation, I was able to see that there was an opening, and I didn't say I need to go left. There was just the going of left. Right? It's a little bit like that when it comes to discerning some of the unwholesome from wholesome aspects. But I do want to add one thing, because I'm first and foremost an ethicist. So I think ethics or morality at least can start with, it depends on where one wants to start, but one of the things I suppose I would say is something I like from Alan Wallace's book, The Four Immeasurables, a book I'm currently reading. And he states quite clearly that at least what we should be with ethics is with a set of don'ts. This is not amber. It's not rule-based. It's not amber in terms of an integral theory. don't do this, do that. But it is a sense of we need to avoid the worst forms of misconduct that we can agree, killing and stealing and things like that. We can agree upon, and gossiping. We can start to say, well, gossiping, that's a bad thing. I don't know how much philosophical contemplation is necessary to conclude that gossiping is a bad thing. And you start to roll out some precepts, and you memorize the precepts, 10 ethical precepts in Buddhism, and you literally learn them by heart to a point which they're internalized, and they begin to inflect the actual in-situation practice. So one of the reasons I accepted your invitation to talk today is the 8th or 9th precept. I resolve not to withhold spiritual and material aid, but give them freely where needed. Well, I'm talking to a friend. I hope this is a benefit to other people. This seems like a good example of actually applying the precept of providing some modicum of spiritual aid to others. Did I cogitate about all those things? I didn't really deliberate. Deliberation is a separate, more Aristotelian category, but those are in hard cases that we still need philosophical deliberation. The easy cases, low-hanging fruit, are just the ones in which we begin to spontaneously and intuitively understand what the right thing to do is. So I don't know if I answer your question, but non-dual ethics, non-dual teaching really can't do without ethical practice. That's just, I only gave you kind of a low-hanging fruit answer, but there are lots of other reasons why it not only can it not do without it, but it also fundamentally needs and requires ethical practice.
So the thing that comes to mind now is, based on what you said, how do we account for gurus and awakened spiritual teachers who seem to behave in unethical ways?
Well, there are lots of ways of accounting for those figures. I'm just thinking because the first answer is the one I think we're both familiar with. That would be spiritual bypass. That's, I think, a consensus answer that's been given. And spiritual bypass, your listeners might not know, refers to having some psychological baggage. I would call it samskaras, frankly, but you can call it samskaras, shadows. There's all sorts of stuff in this category. I don't know if there've been. I still haven't seen people who have really sorted this out. So I'm hoping at some point to provide a more cohesive account of these subcategories of stuff, baggage, and such. But in any case, the psychological baggage is presumably that which has been bypassed. So you think about a highway or motorway bypass, and you've come to realization. Meanwhile, the body-mind, this instrument, has not been refeng shuied properly. So it's not actually functioning in accordance with the realization. And thus it's left basically with selfishness or self-centeredness. As a consequence, its predilections can still be active. So sexual appetite, we still find that today. I think Kudalasa is one recent figure who had pretty strong sexual predilections, I think. And he was recently asked to leave his. I don't know enough much about the situation, but I can give you other examples prior to that. But I'm just suggesting that even though it seems as though in the West we're doing a little bit better at this than we were doing 40, 50 years ago. It's still happening. So that's one account.
Just to respond to that account, that makes me think that processing samskaras is not necessary for awakening and realization. Is that what you're saying? You can still have samskaras and be awakened, or are these individuals not awakened?
Okay. Well, that gets us into. That gets us into. These are all wonderful questions. I just want you to know they're all really big ones, which is great. And so the reason I'm pausing is I want to give a reasonably condensed answer. So I'm in the school of Zen Buddhism that says that there's what's called sudden awakening, gradual cultivation. This is, I think, a pretty reasonable view to take. And it basically states that we should distinguish between, I suppose, sudden awakening and great enlightenment. Sudden awakening is just a glimpse of our true nature. This is why Zen calls it kensho. It's a momentary dropping of the body mind. It's a momentary dropping, therefore, of minding and of its spatio-temporal nexus.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And there's a realization, or seeing into the nature, seeing the nature of things. I don't know if you've read this, but if you hear first-person narratives, though, there is a coming back, so to speak, right? Coming back. Think about psychedelics. Some people report in psychedelics that they've come into this non-dual state, perfectly fine. But what Ram Dass found, and this is the reason why in the 1970s he was starting to become skeptical of psychedelics himself, is that he always come down, as he says, in his famous book, Be Here Now. And it was despairing for him. But in any event, right? So he's going into these non-dual states. There's nobody here. There's just pure awareness, and returning to body mind, or whatever we wish to call it. So the first way of understanding what might be going awry with ethical scandals is that if you don't have a good enough tradition with good enough teachers and a good enough confirmation process, you can think that that's it. Wow, okay, realize it all. This is one reason why I think we should be very careful when it comes to YouTube today. That sounds really old fuddy-duddy. I'm sorry.
No,
YouTube.
I like this.
The YouTube.
I think we should be very careful with the YouTube.
I just mean that there are a number of people who are coming out and they're proclaiming to be spiritual teachers of various stripes, and I'm sure some of them are legitimate, but that requires actually ratiocination, rational processes to discern. That is a rational process to start to discern, where is this person? And one of the ways you begin is actually through philosophizing. So this is some philosophical concepts we have at hand. One, that person may have had a sudden awakening, but it's not full or great awakening. Well, that's happened. A number of people have experienced momentary cessations of the body mind, right? My wife and I have experienced that, but I don't. It's not on that account alone, right? That it follows that it's all over, so to speak.
Right.
So what Zen suggests is that no, these are great experiences. These are important, kensho, but you have a teacher there to confirm that this is, first of all, it's legit, not makyo, which is illusion of various kinds. So that's what helps. If you have a teacher and that teacher is advanced, then you're getting some outside help. Yes, that's right. This is, you're onto it. But that one will go on to say, teacher, now you really need to practice. Now it really starts, as some teachers will say. Because now there'll need to be perhaps more kenshos, right? More of these tastes or glimpses, as Francis Asile calls them. And you'll need to start to have the body-mind become this instrument that is a complete, empty, clear vessel for the actions of Buddha nature, as Zen Buddhists call it, or God, as I was calling it earlier. So hopefully this is clear. That's sudden awakening, gradual cultivation. So we should see that the gradual cultivation is going to be lifelong. This lifelong. I think that's, even if it's not correct, I think it's a really nice fail-safe device. Okay? You know, there are very few Ramana Maharshis who seem to have been in the camp of sudden awakening, sudden cultivation. I think that's such a rare case. He awakens at the age of 16. The documentaries seem to suggest that he was pretty much done, so to speak, at that point. He was complete, beautiful, divine light shining forth in this particular form. But I'm skeptical that we should take that as our standard. It's better to think of modern Maharshis as beautiful, wonderful example of what's possible, but without treating that as paradigmatic. That's not paradigmatic at all. It's paradigmatic are these little glimmers, right? So hopefully it's clear that the sudden awakening, gradual cultivation allows there to be a lot of room. So if this is sudden awakening of my left finger, and this is full realization of my right finger, there's actually a lot of room for shit to hit the fan, right? It's accounted for because the gradual cultivation itself is going to be better or worse right? So that's a hopefully that helps as well.
Yeah, I really like that. So it kind of organizes some of the other stuff we were talking about, because um, the way I'm at least interpreting this is that the gradual cultivation period is is that is the period where you have the chance to process the samskaras,
Mhm.
and it's also the period where it starts off effortful, but then perhaps at some point in the gradual cultivation process, it seems like it's just happening on its own, and you start to realize that it's been happening on its own.
That's all true. Yeah. This is for this reason. When it comes to the practical matter of anyone who's interested in um, sitting with a spiritual teacher, one has to be actually quite discerning. It's said that only a fully enlightened being can recognize a fully enlightened being. That is what it was said. But there is a question of more or less, which is very important, right? And you can start to ask yourself, so I'm just, I don't know if this is helpful, but there are sort of practical questions. What is it like to be in the presence of this one? And if shouldn't be ethereal, but if there's not a kind of uplift, a well-being, then there's a red flag. There should be some sense of being genuine upswell, but without going into ecstatic states. This is not Burning Man, right? So that's a bad litmus test to apply. You should also be able to see whether or not, in philosophical terms, there is some modicum of wisdom. So philosophically speaking, I define wisdom as right conduct flowing directly from right understanding. So if this one really has the understanding more or less, then we should see that manifesting the conduct. What is it like for her to eat? How does she walk? How does she? There's a story. There's a story told about a very advanced Zen Buddhist practitioner, and the story goes. So people are asking, well, you seem to be pretty far along. Why do you keep remaining with your Zen or Chan master? And his reply is, I should like to see how he ties his shoes. So, in other words, right, I want to see his entire conduct of life, and I want to know how he does it all. And I don't think he's trying to poke holes in how realize this one, but he's obviously trying to see how well integrated does one need to be? How fully integrated does one need to be with this understanding?
I have a question about gradual cultivation.
Okay.
In the past, we've talked about different types of meditation, and I think a model that you've used is there are 4 different practices that ultimately amount to the same thing, but it's helpful to think of them as discrete.
Yeah.
Can you go through them? Describe what they are.
Let me preface it by saying that I'm still beginning my, so I'll give you a little background. I have a bit of a research project given myself. And the research project, one that I think Timothy Conway and others have begun before me, is to ask, if I look at Kashmir Shaivism or Advaita Vedanta, Zen Buddhism, Chan Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, so forth, if I look at their texts and what they're teaching, can I find independent lines of convergence on a central teaching? Independent lines of convergence. It's just not the case that Zen Buddhists would have had any familiarity with Christian mysticism, for example. But can we start to see patterns, and can we start to hammer out what the essential teaching seems to be? So to me, it's a second axial age project. The first axial age gives rise to a number of these teachings, into philosophy, into Taoism, into Buddhism, Jainism, and to the Jewish prophets. It gives rise to a soteriological project, that is the project of seeking salvation, right, in some form or another. Second axial age, I think, is is asking other questions. How do we find lines of convergence? Is it also possible for there to be collective awakening?
Mm.
Some more ecologically minded Buddhists are asking. So that's in the background. Um, so as it pertains to the 4 meditations, one more preparatory remark. These are just ones that I've come to so far as being, I think, helpful. Might have been the way these are not the only ones. I didn't include any that had to do with visualization.
Right.
I'm not very good at visualizing myself. So, imagine the Garuda, the beautiful, beautiful light on the lotus blossom coming into your heart state. It doesn't really. My wife could probably do it, but my visual imagination is very impoverished, so that wasn't included on the list.
Mm-hmm. I'll add that I found this very helpful to me personally, just
Okay.
because I started to notice, well, once you kind of gave this taxonomy, I started to notice my that I was doing these different things, and I was just calling them meditation and putting them in one bucket.
Yeah.
But being able to distinguish them was very helpful.
Yeah. They have slightly different flavors and orientations.
Mm-hmm.
So we've already spoken about one, which is Samskaras. Ken Wilber calls that cleaning up. So the idea there is, for me, in a very involved way, to start to identify and to clear, quiet the samskaras, to polish the mirror, as sometimes said in these quarters. That's one. Their whole range of meditations that could fall under that header. That's also a really nice one to begin with some people with who are more secular minded, because they can say to themselves, I'm hurting,
Mm-hmm.
I'm suffering. Hopefully I can get to that point. They can say, I'm hurting, I'm suffering. This is the first noble truth in Buddhism. It takes a little while to realize, though, that, I'm suffering. It's not just the case. People in Afghanistan and Syria are suffering. They are suffering, and pretty profoundly, but, oh, wow, I'm suffering too. So this is a little, one has to transcend the green meme for a certain form of social justice consciousness to get around to the possibility that I too am suffering, right? So it's a kind of those are nice. The samskaric investigations really help us to, I think, very clearly to identify the relative sources of our suffering.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way I would put it. Next category. There are all sorts of meditations that have to do with one-pointedness, which you've already alluded to, or one-pointed concentration. And I'm imagining this moment that maybe your friends or viewers aren't familiar with those terms. Maybe I'm just going to assume that they're not that familiar with
Sure, yeah.
the different types of meditation. So you have to begin with what it's like to go throughout the day, and you start to realize that there's a wanderingness, associative wanderingness about the mind. It's arising in the form of its wandering. It goes from a perception to a thought, and the thought gets carried away with a story. I'm sure you've heard this before. There's a desultory, dispersive route. Yeah, you have a.
Well, I'm just thinking about how this pops up for me, where it's analogous to when you realize you've spent an hour on YouTube and you're watching something that you didn't even know you cared about. And then if you look back, it's because somebody sent you a link that seemed relevant to maybe the project that you were working on that you've since abandoned. And I find a lot of people relate to that experience because the internet allows for that tangential, like discursive, unconscious rabbit holing. But I notice my thoughts are like that too, where sometimes I'll catch myself thinking something. I'm like, how did I end up here? And then you realize that you've just been taken for a ride for the last, 2 minutes that you weren't even aware that you were on.
Yeah. My wife nicely calls that taking the bait. The thought arises and it's like, oh, this is so delicious. And you take it, and then you're right. And then it's a little bit like some kind of movie in which you end up in a cornfield and you have no idea how you got into the cornfield. You were in Toronto.
Right.
How did you get to Iowa across the border in the United States? So in any case, hopefully it gives us some flavor of the wanderingness, dispersive, unenergeticness. It's also very low energy, or it's kind of a hiccup of energy. That's very interesting too. So the one-pointed meditations, maybe I'll give an example in a moment. basically involves using an object, some kind of object or another, such as the breath or count, to allow the mind to concentratedly rest on whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's as if it's unstable. I don't want to mislead here. The mind itself is not an entity. It's a rising phenomenon, but in English language, it's hard not to hypostasize it, to treat it as if it were some kind of static entity in which it's happening, or to give it a kind of agency. So that should be borne in mind as I speak. So the mind starts to rest its attention on the object for some time, and then there's usually a flavor of contentment, calmness. It will coincide with the breath being more regular and slower, a bit like it is in good sleep. And the body itself will feel, the physical body, the gross physical body will feel relaxed. So all those come together, quieting in the mind, the prana, energetic body, the breath, regular, and the physical body is relaxed, no longer tense. So one simple example of one-pointed meditation would be shamatha from Tibetan Buddhism. It's very close to anapana, a certain form of Buddhism. It's very simple. Let's suppose you just take the object, and the object here, it would be the physical sensations in the nostrils. Specifically, you would select, this is the way I teach it, you would select, let's say, your right nostril if there's more sensate activity, especially early on. Right? So you don't just focus on both nostrils because it can feel as if there's a flickering. We'd focus, let's say, on the right nostril, and specifically the opening of the nostril. Now you have a point for the attention to place itself on.
Mm-hmm.
And now there's going to be wandering thoughts, but the more you come to, it's a very interesting process. At first, it seems like you have to tussle with thoughts. It's as if you're really getting yanked into thoughts or emotions, or whatever. But if you actually diligently stick with it long enough, there's a gestalt shift according to which this is so much nicer and sweeter and clearer and brighter than the realm of thought or than emotionality, that it starts to have its natural attractive quality. It's very, very neat. So that's one point of meditation. Some traditions suggest that this is a preparatory exercise for some other kinds of meditation. It seems to be true in Tibetan Buddhism, so far as I can tell. Or Anapana in the Goenka tradition of Vipassana starts with getting more and more one point to the nostrils, so you can begin to investigate physical sensations through what's called a body scan.
Mm-hmm.
You would just track physical sensations across the face. I've done this at a 10-day retreat. They're pretty commonplace in Canada, the United States. So the first part, one-pointedness, is making possible a certain kind of investigation. So the third category I pointed out is the one that's quite attractive for people today. Some circles you hear a great deal about it. It's called direct path or direct pointing. I don't know enough about Dogen or Mahamudra yet, but I hope to learn more in time. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to table those. I'm only familiar with Self-Inquire by Ramana Maharshi and with Koan and Huatao in Zen and Chan, respectively. The essential idea, we can talk about it intellectually here. It's not quite the same thing as experiencing it. The essential idea is that there is typically a question that's utilized to, so to speak, crack open the finite, limited mind and to reveal right here, right now, our original face. So I put that in Zen language. So I can put it in Ramana Maharshi language. If you ask, so Ramana Maharshi, in a classical way, he's only in his 20s at this point, and he provides us with this amazing text called "Who Am I?" Very short text. It's readily available on the internet. And someone asks, the person asks, well, how do you do it? And he says, okay, well, whenever a thought arises, you ask, to whom does the thought arise? And then you can, so you're using discourse for a moment, you're using thought. And the answer is to me. And then he says, ask, who am I? And there are other versions called whence am I, but stick with the original one. Who am I? And all he says there is, we get into a little bit of the theory, but all the question itself is meant to get beyond discursive mind, or prior to discursive mind, and to allow one to begin to dwell in what he calls the I thought. We already experimented with I am for a moment, so I would say they're comparable. This I am state, right? Before the arising of any I am this or I am that. And usually the direct pointing is very interesting because it really brings us into theology very quickly. All the traditions I'm familiar with basically state that only, if I may use a Christian term here, divine grace, only divine grace can finally bring us home. So all we can do is rest and I am, really rest, really make that our semi-permanent domicile, as it were. That's what meditation is doing. It's bringing us back to the penultimate place. And then, to put it somewhat agentially, God brings us the rest of the way home. God brings us back to God's self, or God realizes God's self, and whatever else. That's direct pointing. A great example would be Francis of Sales, who's a contemporary Advaita Vedanta teacher who teaches a direct path. And his student is named Rupert Spira. Rupert Spira has become very popular, and he also teaches direct path through his various kinds of yoga meditations and through his satsangs. So those are very contemporary examples. And the last type.
Let me offer a personal reflection on the direct pointing. For me, the way this comes up in my daily life is I might have a physical sensation, like, for instance, this table feels kind of cold to my right hand. And then the question will sometimes arise, who is the one that's experiencing the cold table? And all of a sudden the physical sensation becomes quite salient to me. And then I think, well, Daniel's the one who's experiencing this. And then immediately what comes after that is, where is this idea of Daniel emerging? Like, what are the constituents of Daniel at an experiential level? Yeah. And that starts to bring up other stuff. So then I'll start to notice thoughts that make me think of me as Daniel. And then often more physical sensations until there's like a fixation. So for me, that whole experience going from the sensation of my hand against the table.
Wait, until there's a fixation? What do you mean by that?
Like a bait or a place where I get stuck.
Okay.
The inquiry gets stuck at a physical sensation typically. And I think I've shared this before, where oftentimes it's my back. Like there's like a plane of awareness that like stops at just like my back. Yeah. And that's where Danielness is kind of coming from, or it feels very fixed compared to all the other stuff that I'm able to see as just kind of arising. That thing doesn't feel as I guess up in the air. And that whole experience has the quality of almost like stepping back. Like it feels like I'm getting behind something. Or it's a physical sensation of falling back almost. And then usually for me, there's a point where it kind of stops, or my mind, I get bored of it or something, and my mind trails off again.
Okay, that's a very good anecdote or description of partly how it looks. One of the reasons this is attractive to people with strong analytical backgrounds like you and me is that it actually allows you to use inquiry, philosophical inquiry, but to start to deepen it and change its direction of sorts. that's why I find it so attractive to me. Oh, I've been doing this for about a decade or so, and how great that Ram Maharshi is basically helped to create a genre that borrows from or draws from what we're accustomed to, but then takes up a notch or two. So I think that's why probably people who are friends of yours might find this to be really quite engaging, quite mysterious, quite fascinating. That's just about the appeal.
Right.
So when it pertains, so if we actually go into self-inquiry for a moment, and then we'll come to the fourth category about opening the heart. Self-inquiry is also humbling. What you described is quite humbling. So if you ask yourself, who am I? In the Tamil language, what they say, according to a disciple of Maharshi named Sri Sadhu Om, what they say is that, what he says is that everything starts to become second and third person. Second person, I learned this from the translator of this pure text, because I don't speak Tamil, obviously. The second person refers to any object of sense data, or any, right? So it's immediately out in front, as it were. Right? So think about your physical senses. They feel, if you start to get into this, they start to feel out in front, right? So if you wiggle your fingers or so and you feel physical sensations, notice that feels out in front of you, whoever this you is. The third person refers to an object of thought, right? So they would say that, well, Sadhu Om says that God is an object of thought. That's, so to speak, also out in front or above, right? So what's happened, what you're describing is very interesting, but it's revealing, humbly so, the errant or wrong answers. So the physical sensation, okay, well, who is it that's experiencing this? Now you start, we can do it right now. Okay, so you feel something, you have a physical sensation. You ask, well, who is it or what is it that is experiencing this right now? Now, there should be a kind of pause. In other words, don't fill it in with don't know, but it's the equivalent, the experiential equivalent of don't know. Anytime there is a no, it's going to be a wrong answer. There'll be another physical sensation. Oh, it's that feeling in my back. Notice that there's the attention tries to go toward an object. That feeling in my shoulder, that pain in my stomach, that thought about the thought about a personality. See how it's attention is starts to move, but so let's ask the question again. So if I'm neither a physical sensation nor thought nor an emotion, then who or what am I? And if the rational mind comes again and tries to supply an answer, quite frankly, it will always be the wrong answer. Yeah. So we just ask the question again. And we keep asking it until there is a kind of humble, open resting. And the humble, open resting is a resting in awareness. Awareness is non-objective. Attention is objective. Attention is always attending to objects. So really, who am I is, I feel like asking the question, what is this awareness? It's non-objective awareness. Anyway, what is this that doesn't go anywhere, doesn't come from anywhere, doesn't seem to have any ordinary properties, doesn't seem to have any delineations, seems to be without limit, at least none is ascertainable. It's neither going this way nor going that way. It's not nothing in the ordinary sense, but it really is no thing. Who am I? What am I? What is this? That's a Hua Tao version. What is this? And so the the Ramana Maharshi's version of this direct path is just to get you to, as he would say, rest in this, or to abide as this. Thus, self-inquiry is also called self-abidance. And you should be able to experience it. Weirdly, let me try that sentence again. This should be clear right now. Now, anytime you try to, as my Zen teacher would say, anytime you try to turn this into something, there's been a misstep, an out in frontedness. Well, let's open eyes. So that's a pretty simple demonstration. I think the power of self-inquiry. Now, the reason I think it's helpful to have one-pointedness, people disagree about this point, but I think one-pointedness actually is quite helpful because it can allow us to more readily stay as awareness. We've done some prior training so that even though that was about attention to an object and resting on the breath, still there was the training to rest on something. Now we can try to rest, now we can rest on no thing. It's a stabilizing of an otherwise chaotic, dispersive mind, and now the mind can step back. So Zen Master Dogen says, take the backward step and turn the light within. And that's the direct pointing that I'm most familiar with, thus I spoke most about it.
So far we have recognizing samskaras. Mm-hmm. We have one-pointedness, such as paying attention to the left nostril. Mm-hmm. And then we just described the direct approach. Is that what you call it? Direct pointing.
Direct pointing. Yeah.
And the fourth one is heart opening. Yeah.
So these get us into all sorts. But basically, let's begin by describing the heart as if it were some kind of physical something or other. That's not quite accurate, but it's the best we can do. And at this point in most of our lives, I suspect most of us can tune into the fact. It takes a while to understand, but tune into the fact that our hearts are closed, mostly closed. It's been a fairly intellectual conversation today, but if you just sense into that for a moment, you'll feel that there's a certain ache when there's a beautiful ache when the heart opens, and there's a terrible ache when the heart is closed. When you had this cruel thought about someone, or you discounted someone. Now I'm using thoughts to try to articulate this closed heart, but the closed heart is the prior condition for the rising of those thoughts and emotions to begin with. So the heart, I think of being a bit like this unitive, intuitive faculty, and usually we place the heart. And this is quite accurate, but it's a good starting point. Usually place it about 2 finger lengths to the right, opposite the physical, the actual physical heart, because it can feel as if that's what's opening during certain meditations. It feels as though it can come from there and go outwards. So these meditations are very different. The ones to start with that might seem a little bit less woo to some, perhaps, it would be metta in Buddhism. So that would be a loving kindness meditation. I'll describe it briefly so we have a few other kinds of heart opening meditations. So you basically start with your relative self, and you might do a 4 yearnings in Tibetan Buddhism. May I be free from enmity. hatred, ill will, etc. May I be free from affliction. May I be free from anxiety. May I be happy and well. And I want to really feel that. And then you're going to keep, it's said that we want to now go to our dear ones and loved ones, and we go to our friends. We're going to keep going outward till we go to family members. You keep moving from that natural loving sensitivity until you get to the point of your enemy, your rival. And that's the really sticky one. Now, some people might think, given that maybe your friends are all Canadian, they might think, "Oh, I don't have any enemies."
Right.
Oh, it's bullshit. I mean, we all have them. I mean, you don't call them my enemy, but you feel ill will, you feel aversion, you think ill of them. You wonder why they were promoted. It doesn't really matter, right? So there certainly are people in our repertoire of people we know. And if we really tune in, we'll find that we really don't like this person. Right? And perhaps with good reason, but that has to do with a certain set of traits or characteristics. What Buddhism is trying to show us that there's Buddha nature. Just Christianity is trying to show us that traditional Christianity wants to show us that we're made in the image and likeness of God, and thus are God's children. And so hate the sin and love the sinner. Buddhism wants to say you are Buddha nature, and these are just peripheral traits, dispositions, karmic heritage. So I find that to be a very similar distinction in actual practice. So you want to be able to actually get to a point where you can open your heart to the enemy. And the last one is opening your heart to all beings. And there are various ways of doing so. That's one. There are different kinds. I'll give you one other one so that we don't go through the whole panoply. Ram Dass has one, which is very simple. He'll just say, some of these are light oriented, so you can have energy and light comes into your heart, you have certain qualities that come in, and maybe there's a removal of certain unwholesome qualities and the bringing in of certain wholesome qualities. But he has one in which he says on the out breath, I'm loving awareness. And you rest in the heart space, I'm loving awareness. I've done that one. I think it's quite good. So if someone were to ask, what's the point of this one? It provides something that I think is missing in Zen, in my experience. Zen is very quieting. If you look at Zen practitioners, they're very woo, shi gu se gan mon, shi yo hyun ten, as a feeling of parodic. We were doing that earlier, but it's ritualistic. It's looks very disciplined from the outside. Looks very quiet, dark. Symbol is the moon, right? The symbol is more the moon. There's a certain energy, I think, associated with it. I think it's created a number of things, but I think there needs to be some bhakti elements, kirtan elements, so as to balance out the yin and the yang. Right? There needs to be some celebratory, outflowing, spontaneous acts of love. And the heart-opening ones really do that. They provide that. Being very quiet is great, but I'll give. I feel so better on that abstract today. So here's a very concrete example. So I have a wife and a dog, a puppy, and we're on these. The question I ask myself when we're on a retreat, in particular at home, a home retreat, is how am I going to balance the quieting of the mind through these various, most especially through direct pointing. I'm going to balance. That's going to be really quiet, soft, and the inquiry comes to be so rich. I'm walking around. Who am I? Going to the bathroom. Who am I? To make the wash dishes. Who am I? Meanwhile, there are two sentient beings who love me and who I love, and something is asked of me in certain cases. Right? So at the end of a meditation in Zen, you would just bow, but I come over and snuggle my wife and dog, right?
Right.
That's not really Zen.
Right.
Crawling across the floor and lying on your side and petting a 14.5-pound dog and lying with my wife is not, but it's heart opening. I think of it as just a very simple, natural heart opening exercise. So hopefully it gives some texture to the differences.
Just to add my own personal experience here, something that works quite reliably for me to open the heart. And maybe people can try this if they don't really know what that feeling is of heart opening. It's if I take somebody who's important to me, let's say a family member, who for whatever reason in this moment I have some kind of irritation with, or last interaction wasn't that great or something. And if in that context I do a brief, I guess like visualization or contemplation about the fact that one day they will die, or one day I will die. And I can sometimes get imaginative about this. Like, what if I got a phone call or something, or, what if I heard about a car accident, like something like that, just making it kind of real for me. Very quickly, there's like this softening in the front of my body.
Right.
And it's quite reliable, even if I'm in an argument, and if I remember to do that and to really think about how there will one day be the last time I talk to this person, that that makes my heart just open. And I don't know what else to call that feeling.
No, that's right.
But yeah, heart. That's what heart openness often means to me.
Yeah, and a couple of things. I experience it. I experience it as a kind of ache. That's why I used the word earlier, a poignancy. But I don't want to go too off the rails here. I don't actually think that's, in my nomenclature, it's not really an emotion. Because I tend to think of emotions as temporary states of things that come and go. This is actually access to the fundamental nature of reality. When Christians say God is love, I think that's literally true. Right. In fact, I don't just think it. I've had some tastes that seem to give me sufficient body of evidence to suggest that it's true. So that ache or poignancy is this. It's stronger than the word connecting, but it is almost like a yearning, right? A longing, and a movement toward that my cup runneth over. There's a feeling of this overwhelmingness in a positive sense here, right? And we already experience it. We already experience it in terms of crying or laughing or something like that. That could happen, but it could just be this tug. Yeah, and you're right. It's a softening. And the what's nice about the Nondual teaching is it has a way of providing substantiation for why this would be so. Well, I'll quote Rupert Spire. He's got a very nice short poem. He says, "In separation." Oh, let's hold on. Yes, in separation, I am somebody. In union, no, he says, in separation, I'm no one. In union, I. Try that again. This is a recording, right? I'm just kidding. In separation, I am someone. In union, I am no one or nothing. In love, I'm everything. Oh, I blew it again. Let me try it once more. This is good. In separation, I am something. He's very schematic, so I want to make sure I get a schematism right. In separation, I'm something. In union, I am nothing, no thing. In love, I'm everything. So there we got it. Had fun. So that's that is the heart openness is the smallest possible taste, the amuse-bouche of the love that we are. Right? And it's intimating at the unicity of all, the wholeness of all. Right? When you're angry at your mother, you have to presume that she's a separate entity that's saying something that's infringing upon you, and you're angry because you're a separate entity. But when the heart opens, it's the loss of that finite being, but it's cluing you into the substratum that's holding all of us up. That's why there's a kind of rather somber or melancholic beauty about heart openness. It's like, oh, this one's gonna go. Buddhism, right? Buddhism 101, anicca, impermanence. this one's going to go, but there's also this sweetness. It's really strange, right? The
Yeah.
sweetness of it all being held in the pelvic floor of reality, even as this one or that one comes and goes. So that's why the heart openness is, I mean, this is also some theoretical sounding, but the actual experience is this experience of, oh, well, here we are, right? Here we are, this moment, right? Right here, or right here. And this moment has such texture, this experience right now has such richness, such profound. It's so profound.
It's precious.
It's precious. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you think okay, if suffering, if all suffering is due to separation,
Mm-hmm.
do you think that what everybody is ultimately trying to do here with all their goals, to get somewhere in their career, to get some level of physical fitness, to make money, to get better at a musical instrument, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think those are all basically misguided pathways to experiencing love?
Yeah, there are two really nice ways of applying to that question. But first, to be to be clear about the cause of suffering, I might have been a little bit clear. It's not due to separation per se. There's going to be the many. It's due to the identification with the separate entity, and that's what's called ignorance. So, as Francis of Sales says, suffering is born of the belief and feeling that I am a limited, separate consciousness. So, I hope that helps. So, back to the question. So, there are two ways of talking about whether it's misguided. One is to say, in a form of neti, not this, not this. Dude, you're going for the job. That's not it.
Mm-hmm.
No, okay. So we can do a simple philosophical inquiry. What is it that you want? Well, I want this job. Why do you want the job? Because it's couched in this career. Why do you want this career? Because the career is going to bring me fulfillment, I guess, or meaning. Here's one of those value-laden words there. And if you can investigate that further through various ways, you'd come to see that no career can actually do that. It's completely impossible.
Mm-hmm.
It's a misplaced demand. So evidently that career is not it. And usually we see is lateral movement, such that the person goes to the next career or the next job or whatever else, and you start to see that. But after all those things have been negated, not this, not this, then people keep sliding. Oh, it's this relationship. I'm going to fixate on that. It's this particular person I love. It's this one and this one I know. Right? If you can investigate that, you realize, oh no, this is not it. She could die or he could die. He or she could cheat on me, hypothetically speaking, right? This too is impermanent. So two parts, the three marks of existence in Buddhism. One is anicca, impermanence. The other one is dukkha, or suffering, dis-ease, disturbance. Wait, that's not it either. So you're getting the inquiry going. This is the neti. This is a deconstructive approach, right? And you can, so I've done this a number of times with people, and you see it to a point at which it's not status, it's not a certain level of wealth. It's essentially most of the secular goods that are being offered and advocated for turn out not to be it,
Mm-hmm.
where it is going to be what I truly seek, right? What it is that will answer my heart's yearning with this deep, eternal rest or peace. So that's one way of going about it. The other way we find in Kashmir Shaivism, or Nondual Shaiva Tantra, as it's called, is really elegant. And you and I have done this before. It's to say that you want sense pleasure, right? So what is it that what is happiness? It's sense pleasure. You invite the person. Maybe I shouldn't use that one. That sounds. I'm misunderstanding. Tantra really is not concerned with sexual gymnastics. So
Right.
maybe I'll use a different example. So that confuse people. Let's take one from academia. You think that happiness is tantamount to intellectual knowledge. If you can get someone to go deeply into it, so not to critique the misguidedness of it, but to go deeply into it, it will blossom open into the all.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a better example. Let me try one other example. Let's take sadness. So you have a somatic meditation, you go into the nature of sadness. The sadness is in the belly somewhere. Okay, you can ask the question, kind of guide and say, well, what is that sadness really longing for? It's longing for, make a number of connection or togetherness, let's say. Okay, well, you can start to see that what it's really longing for is togetherness, but of the kind that is completely ineradicable, ungainsayable, complete, whole, perfect. Right? So even in our deepest, so this would be very hard, people who are in deep sorrow, but even in our deepest sorrows, even in our fears, even in our angers, if we were to dilate into it, there ends up being an expansion of the anger, let's say, into love, or expands into care. Anger, some have said anger means I care a lot. Right? Presupposition anger is I care a lot. You expand into the care, you go through care, you get into perhaps compassion. I might say you deepen compassion, since I have Christian background, you come to love. Both of those are completely acceptable. It's going to depend on the person, whichever one you use. If someone is really quite hubristic, then you might engage that person in the constructive approach,
right,
to clip the wings. If the person tends to be a little more sensitive, and you really don't want to push too hard, and say, well, this is wonderful. You have a longing for happiness. This is great. And you identify the happiness with this object. Can we somatically inquire to a point at which it becomes clear that no, this is just a contingent happiness. I can give you one example from my wife's life. She kept bringing this example up in years past when we first met, 2012. She would say, there's a time I was in Kirkwood, California, and my friend and I were lying on this rock, and the sun was just so, and she would return to that example over and over again, as if 10 years ago, as if it was an attribution error, I call it. No, it's Kirkwood, right? Happiness is Kirkwood. Whereas from a mystical or Nondual point of view, there's just been a slight disclosure. No, the genuine peace, love, or happiness that is our very source, that is our wellspring, is everywhere, and nowhere in particular. And it's also in Kirkwood.
Right.
And it happens to be like a lotus flower blossoming out of the mud right here. And it's revealing itself. So what I find many people do is they'll say, oh no, it's climbing. Climbing is where clear it is. I call it attribution error. You attribute it to the object, and then you attach to the object, rather than realizing that the activity or object or whatever it was is just disclosing the essential nature of love itself.
Last question for you.
Okay.
And feel free to take your time in responding to this, but what would you say is of utmost importance?
That's a loaded question. You don't have an answer to that question. Okay. Well, I honestly think there are three answers. So, but I think you knew that already. This is what three I think are really hard. They feel very unimpeachable to me, and I could try to take the other two and have a reduction base, but I don't really feel inclined to do that. So so what I do think is waking up. It's an Eastern path of realizing our true nature or realizing our original face. I think I can articulate that one very easily by saying there's a certain question that almost all of us have once we become self-reflective enough. And the question we have is, why do I suffer? You ask that question essentially. And what will be the end of the suffering? that's what these Eastern paths are specifically designed to tackle. That's what's amazing about them. They actually take extraordinarily seriously this obvious experience that we have. And the obvious experience we have too is that there's a lot of suffering. If we're being really honest with ourselves, that's the part that's really difficult. If we're being really honest with ourselves, then we have a lot of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
It can take a while for someone to see that if someone is privileged or comes from a certain background and has had good fortune. It's really hard to even show that person. No, you're also suffering. One translation of dukkha I just came upon a few days ago is disturbance. Mm. So dukkha meaning dis-ease, dissatisfactoriness, offness, things being a little awry. Disturbance is a good one too. Things are kind of disturbed. They're not just so. I wish they were so. They're not. And that's feels like the locomotive force when I think about the Eastern path. And so it is awakening, but it changes along the way. It starts with, oh man, I'm suffering. It really hurts. And along the way, the bodhisattva vow becomes very natural, which is, oh, I want to end suffering for all beings. Mm. We haven't really talked about that, but if there is really no ontologically distinct subject called Andrew, then the realization that Andrew, quote unquote, has is the realization all of us have. Right? That's one way of thinking about the Bodhisattva vow. The reason it's ethical, right, in the sense that I want all to be liberated, all sentient beings, but it's also ontological or metaphysical. If there is no self here, then that full realization is the realization of the entire cosmos. Mm-hmm. It has to be, right? That follows logically. In any case, so that brings us to what I think all of us desire. So the Dalai Lama says quite nicely, very beautifully, very clearly, everyone wants happiness, no one wants to suffer. So that's a perfect framing. And we just don't know what happiness is. We don't know that we are suffering. We don't know how much we're suffering. We don't have a path. Many of us don't have a path. We try a lot of the wrong things. So that's a really quite, it's probably part of the path too, but it's a really painful part is to see all the different things that we try that can't possibly satisfy. A rule of thumb I give conversation partners is the following. If whatever approach you take doesn't at least bring about significant progress, then that approach should be jettisoned. Mm. The stronger litmus test is if that approach you take does not promise the end of all of your suffering, then at some point it should be jettisoned. At some point, maybe it has some functional value in the short term, but that really should be our litmus test. Seems like you have a comment before I jump in the other two.
No.
Okay.
It's all clear.
Okay. Well, I feel so sometimes in the Eastern traditions they talk about wisdom, but I do feel that that's a great heritage. So the second path. The second thing of ultimate importance, I think, is wisdom. And when I hear it used among Buddhists, let's say, it's insight or seeing nature clearly. But I don't, and that's perfectly reasonable, and I'm all for that. I just wouldn't call that wisdom. I think the Greeks are better. Basically, I would say that wisdom is, there are different ways of talking about it, but it brings together metaphysics and ethics. So it brings together knowing how to live and living that life consciously based on the proper view of reality, based on a right view, based on what is reality fundamentally. But knowing what reality is fundamentally, enlightenment, doesn't necessarily, in my book, entail wisdom, which is your conduct. So this is another way of answering the question you asked before about how all those teachers could have done those things. But some of them could be realized to some degree or another, but not wise. Because wisdom is going to require, I think, a lifelong cultivation, various ethical practices and reflective practices, to the point at which one is able to have one's conduct flowering, flourishing with the deepest understanding. It will be provisional, need to be revised over time, but basically the wise one is able to say it without having to say it. In this context, compassion may it flow forth. And in this context over here, courage, may that flow forth. It's It's more than an air traffic controller pointing to which virtue needs to be exercised. It's much more than that, but certainly it does that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is basically what the Greeks were giving us as a wonderful gift. How do you lead a wise life? I should say, so I should say, if the first path is concerned with suffering, we suffer. I think the second path is answering the question many of us have had at some point in secular modernity. It's something like, well, I don't know how to live. I don't know what I'm doing here. Something like that would be the way I put it.
Mm.
I don't know if I would agree with your friend John Vervaeke in saying it's an answer to the meaning crisis. I'm not sure that I would quite put it that way. It's more like an answer to the cluelessness crisis. Like we don't know what we're doing here, right? And wisdom locks it in, locks the answer into place.
Mm.
It says, "Oh no, I do know what I'm doing here, right? I know what my conduct is on behalf of it." The metaphor of locking into place at least did it for me. It kind of, it's like a form of concentration. At one point, it kind of locks it all into its proper location or spot. And the third path, we've already hinted at, is the path of love, and it comes out of Christianity, I think. And there is something that's we're responding to in modernity. We haven't really gotten to the modern world today. But I think modernity is very cold, as Theodore Adorno once said in his book, Negative Dialectics. It's a very cold place.
Mm.
I was once talking with an academic, and I said, the university is a, quote, unloving institution. It's beautiful in certain ways. I'm not trying to throw it being the bus, but it's unloving.
Yeah,
now they would say, they would say, well, it's a research program. Of course it is, but yes, but we need love, right? Where are we going to learn love? We're not learning love in the bourgeois home very readily. We're certainly not learning to extend love to all beings. So I think the gospel message is the one that I think is quite beautiful. Love God and love thy neighbor as thyself. Love God and love thy neighbor as the one self that is. So it moves from the sense, when I was after I finished my, so to be clear, after I finished my PhD, so I grew up in a Protestant home, and it's I describe it as very stiff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yes, not very affectionate, but there's a kind of stiffness, a stiff distancing. I'm not saying that we're kind and considerate, but arm's length in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Then I finished a PhD. Boy, was that a miseducation and stiffness,
right,
and intellectuality. And so I feel as though by the end of my 20s, my heart was very closed, not to mention all my forms of my vices, arrogance and such. So it's very real and natural to begin the journey home by opening our heart during a time when things feel so cold and austere and distant. And I'm not persuaded that the word connection, people talk about connection today. I want something a little bit more ambitious. I want something a little bit stronger than connection. Connection's too cybernetic theory-esque, right? We have little nodes, and we're going to draw a line between these two. I want love, right?
Computers are connected.
Yeah, they are connected. All sorts of things are connected. Dots are connected. Right? Yeah. So in answer to the conundrum, how did my heart get so closed? Love, the heart openness, meditations open them. So to the question of suffering, we have awakening, we have genuine peacefulness, true serviceableness, wide awakeness, receptivity to all that is, to the question of cluelessness and a kind of helplessness, waywardness today, right? Even nihilism, if you want to put it that way, but I want to get into the meaning crisis. But this is ennui, this waywardness we have to lead a wise life. And to the question of how did I get so crusty, right? We have heart openness to the point at which love is what's flowing forth. Doesn't mean that everyone who mistreats you is. This is. I want to be clear at the end of our conversation today that I don't mean sentimentality. I don't mean that we're affectionate, we're gushing with affection for everyone. But I do mean that we can we know that which binds all sentient beings together, and we act from that deep place. That's the wellspring of love.
Thank you very much for this conversation today, Andrew.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much for this conversation today, Daniel.